You won't believe this breaking news. After debunking decades of Sasquatch claims, David Paulides finally found the newest Bigfoot evidence from August 2026. Studying the August footage frame by frame, he found himself confronting evidence so impossible that it would force authorities to expose what they've been hiding. On August 1, 2026, something happened in the forests of Northern California that would eventually catch the attention of investigators across the country. For decades, every famous piece of Bigfoot footage had been picked apart and criticized. Either the video was too blurry, too short, too shaky, or it lacked any real context that could help explain what people were looking at. Skeptics always had an easy answer ready, and even believers sometimes struggled to defend the weaker clips that circulated online. But this time, a 6-minute recording surfaced from a source nobody expected, and the investigator who received it had no idea, at first, just how far the discoveries would go. The camera belonged to state wildlife biologists monitoring a local black bear population as part of an ongoing conservation study. Nobody involved in that project was looking for anything unusual. They were tracking feeding patterns, den locations, and seasonal movement, nothing more. The unit itself had been mounted on a sturdy tree trunk overlooking an old, overgrown logging road that hadn't seen regular use in years, angled to catch animals passing through a natural travel corridor in a stretch of forest known mostly to loggers, hunters, and the handful of biologists who worked there each season. For months it had done exactly that, quietly gathering images of bears, deer, and the occasional bobcat without incident. That's exactly why, when longtime investigator David Paulides received a copy of the footage from someone connected to the survey team, he almost didn't open it right away. Wildlife agencies rarely hand footage from their monitoring equipment to outside researchers, since the cameras are considered scientific tools rather than sources of public speculation. Someone inside the project had felt strongly enough about what they'd seen to reach out quietly, outside official channels, and that alone told Paulides this submission might be worth more attention than the usual pile. Still, he had reviewed hundreds of submissions before, most of which turned out to be nothing more than a bear standing at an odd angle or a shadow playing tricks on a low-resolution lens. He expected this to be the same. He was wrong within the first 90 seconds, and he had no way of knowing that the next several weeks would take him from his own desk to a muddy hillside in Northern California, and from there into a pattern that stretched across an entire monitoring network. Here's the thing. Paulides wasn't chasing this story. It found him, and the moment he pressed play, the investigation started moving faster than he could keep up with. Paulides opened the file, expecting the usual disappointment, the same brief letdown that usually arrived within the first 30 seconds of a new submission. Instead, he found himself doing something he rarely bothered doing with footage that seemed obviously staged or misidentified. Rewinding, not because anything was obviously wrong, but because something about the recording felt off in a way he couldn't yet name. The footage opened almost boring. A handful of deer moved slowly through the frame in the background. Ravens called out somewhere overhead. Wind moved gently through the trees, rustling branches in a way that felt completely natural for a quiet summer morning. Nothing suggested anything out of the ordinary was about to happen. Then, 40 seconds in, Paulides caught it on the second pass. Every bird in the area went silent at the exact same moment. Not a slow fade. Not one bird flying off while others kept calling. It was instant. One moment the forest was filled with the normal chatter of wildlife, and the next there was nothing but wind. He sat back from his monitor. Forest environments rarely fall silent all at once, since different species tend to react to different threats at different times. A hawk overhead might silence songbirds without affecting ravens, while an approaching predator on the ground might not bother birds high in the canopy at all. The fact that every audible call stopped within the same instant meant to Paulides that whatever had triggered the reaction was significant enough to affect multiple species across different parts of the forest simultaneously. That alone was enough to make him keep watching instead of closing the file, which is what he usually did by this point in a review. Then a black bear wandered into frame, and it wasn't behaving like a bear. He almost stopped there and wrote it off as an odd clip, but lucky for us, he didn't, and the next 90 seconds would complete completely change what he thought he was looking at. Many discoveries that he made during his new findings in August 2026 can't be shared on YouTube because the information is too sensitive. If you want to learn what truth he found out about Bigfoot, you can go to the link at the top of the description and read my ebook. What you will find there will change your outlook on the Sasquatch forever. Under normal circumstances, a bear on one of these cameras walks through, sniffs around, and moves on. This bear stopped almost immediately and froze. Over the following seconds, it repeatedly turned its head uphill toward a dense stand of trees at the edge of the frame, not startled, not panicked, but watching something with a kind of steady, cautious attention. Rather than bolting, it began backing away, slow and controlled, more restrained than any panic reaction would explain. Paulides slowed the footage down. That's when he noticed what he'd missed the first time. The bear wasn't looking at nothing. There was a shape at the tree line, dark, upright, motionless, that he had scrolled straight past at normal speed because it blended so closely with the shadows and bark behind it. He froze the frame, ran it back, froze it again. The figure wasn't entering the scene. In the very first frame where it became visible, it was already there, standing still as if it had been standing in that spot the entire time, and the camera simply hadn't caught the moment it arrived. Based on comparisons to the nearby trees and underbrush, the figure appeared to stand well above the height of the surrounding vegetation, considerably taller than an average adult man. Its arms hung down past where a human's arms typically would. Its shoulders looked broad and heavy, and its entire body was covered in a dark textured covering closer to matted fur than clothing. That realization changed the entire nature of what Paulides thought he was reviewing. This was no longer a bear acting strangely. Something else had been in frame the whole time, watching the bear, unnoticed, until the animal's own reaction gave it away. One frozen frame was enough to convince Paulides this deserved a much closer look. What he found when he studied the figure itself raised a question that would only get harder to answer. Paulides spent the next several hours doing what he had done with hundreds of hoax submissions before, looking for the seams. In his experience reviewing earlier costume attempts, the shoulder area tended to look stiff and boxy, since most suits relied on padding or a rigid internal frame to create bulk. He watched for that same stiffness here, expecting to find it and move on. He didn't find it. Every few seconds, the figure's head turned slightly toward the bear lower on the hillside, and the shoulders moved with it, shifting naturally with each small adjustment of the head and torso in a way that suggested flexible muscle and tissue rather than a fixed frame underneath a covering. Under magnification, the texture of the dark covering wasn't uniform the way fabric or synthetic fur usually was. It varied slightly in length and direction across the shoulders, arms, and lower body, closer to what would be expected from natural fur that had grown differently across different parts of a living animal. Paulides was careful not to treat that as proof of anything on its own, but it was enough to keep him watching instead of filing the case away. And 3 minutes into the recording, the footage gave him something he hadn't expected to find at all. Without warning, the bear that had been slowly backing away suddenly turned and bolted downhill at full speed. At the exact same moment, the motionless figure at the tree line moved. In what the footage showed as 3 enormous strides, it crossed a significant stretch of open ground near the old logging road, the entire crossing complete in under 2 seconds. Paulides ran the section back immediately, then slowed it down and ran it again. The movement wasn't a run in the way a person runs, with bent knees, pumping arms, and a forward-leaning posture. It looked smooth and controlled, covering ground with a kind of gliding efficiency that seemed unusual for something of that apparent size and weight. Just as strange was what the camera's built-in microphone picked up during the crossing. Despite the figure appearing to take multiple steps across uneven, rocky ground, the audio recorded only a single heavy footfall, not the repeated impacts several strides in a row should have produced. He measured the distance covered against known landmarks visible in the frame, a fallen log and a cluster of large rocks near the edge of the logging road. By that measure, the figure covered a distance that would typically take an average adult man 5 or 6 ordinary steps, all completed in a fraction of the time and without the labored, bouncing gait Paulides had seen in every costumed hoax attempt he'd ever reviewed. That was the moment the footage stopped being a curiosity to Paulides and became an active case. He pulled up a wider view of the frame to see what else the recording might be hiding, and immediately spotted something in the background he had missed entirely on the first 2 passes. A 3-second sprint had just ruled out every hoax explanation Paulides knew how to test for. But it was what he found sitting quietly in the background, almost an afterthought, that told him this might not be one figure at all. Most people who eventually saw this footage online fixated entirely on the standing figure and the sprint across the logging road. Paulides did something different. He went back to the the section just before the figure became visible and started studying the background instead, believing, as he always had, that the smaller details usually told the more convincing story. Going frame by frame, he noticed branches near the tree line moving slightly before the figure itself made any motion. Small rocks and loose debris tumbled down the hillside in the moments beforehand, the kind of disturbance that usually meant something heavy shifting its weight nearby. Then, in a section most casual viewers scrolled straight past, Paulides caught a second disturbance, a brief shift in shadow and a slight movement among branches, further back behind a second row of trees. It lasted barely a second before it was gone, never fully visible. He pulled up a timestamp overlay and checked it against the first figure's head turn. The two events lined up almost exactly. Whatever had shifted the branches in the background moved at nearly the same instant the standing figure turned its head, as if the two were reacting to each other rather than acting alone. That lined up with something Paulides had noticed across hundreds of reports submitted to him over the years, in which witnesses described encountering what appeared to be small groups rather than lone individuals, sometimes of different sizes, which had led some researchers to speculate about family units. He was careful to stress that the second shape was never clear enough to draw firm conclusions from on its own, but the timing was enough to change how he thought about the case. If there were two, the footage wasn't just unusual, it might be the clearest indication yet that this species, if that's what it was, didn't move alone. He couldn't confirm that from behind a screen. He needed to see the ground the footage was shot on. A shape in the trees was one thing. A second shape moving in coordination with it was something Paulides couldn't explain from a monitor. So he did what the original recovery team never did. He went to look for himself. Before he could search anything himself, Paulides had to understand how the footage had even survived. The memory card that should have been inside the camera had gone missing entirely at the time of the incident, and it wasn't recovered until weeks later, when a volunteer helping with the survey happened to be walking the area after a heavy rainstorm had washed away a layer of leaves and loose soil. She nearly missed it. The card was caked in mud and blended easily with the surrounding dirt, and it was only a small glint of plastic catching the afternoon light that made her stop and look twice. She carried it back to the research station wrapped in cloth, unsure whether anything on it would even be recoverable. A specialist eventually restored roughly 5.5 of the original 6 minutes using data recovery software, salvaging the version Paulides now had in front of him, knowing that history changed how Paulides read the footage. This wasn't a clean, uninterrupted recording handed to him intact. It was a fragment that had survived weeks of exposure, a smashed housing, and a partial data failure, and every one of those details was a clue about what had happened at the site that the video itself couldn't show him. Paulides made the trip out to the original location within the week, hoping to find anything that might still remain despite the weeks that had passed since the recording was made. The original recovery team's only goal had been retrieving the missing camera equipment. Nobody had actually searched the site for evidence, which meant nearly everything on the ground was still exactly where it had been left. He started at the base of the hillside, following the same route the recovery team had taken, but this time working slowly uphill toward the tree line where the figure had stood. Instead of sweeping the area quickly, he stopped every few yards to study the ground, checking patches of exposed soil, flattened grass, and loose debris for anything that might have survived the weeks since the incident. It didn't take long before he found something the recovery team had walked right past, a partial impression in the soil, badly degraded by weeks of rain, but still holding enough detail to matter. The outline was incomplete, but several distinct contours remained visible beneath the washed surface. He mixed plaster on site and carefully poured the cast before the light faded, knowing that another heavy rain could erase what little evidence remained. As the plaster cured, he photographed the impression from multiple angles and marked its location before packing it away, aware it might be the only physical trace he'd get. Working the tree line itself, he found more signs that caught his attention. Several young trees had their upper branches snapped and broken at a height of roughly 8 feet off the ground, far higher than where a bear or deer would typically cause that kind of damage. The breaks weren't fresh, but they also weren't old enough to have weathered smooth, suggesting they had happened relatively recently. Nearby, a section of cedar bark had been stripped away from a trunk in long, deliberate strokes, leaving the pale wood underneath exposed. A few feet away, smaller strips of bark lay scattered on the forest floor, and several nearby saplings showed similar damage on a much smaller scale. None of it proved what had been there, but taken together with the cast, The pattern convinced him the hillside deserved far more attention than it had received during the original search. But it was what he found near the second tree line, the spot where the background shape had moved, that stopped him. A cluster of broken branches arranged in a rough, deliberate pattern at the base of a large cedar, unlike anything wind or falling debris would produce. Similar structures had been described to him in past reports from other parts of the country, often referred to by researchers as possible markers left behind in heavily wooded territory. He photographed the arrangement extensively, but was careful not to draw firm conclusions from it on its own, aware that one unusual pattern of branches proved very little by itself. He spent nearly 3 full days at the site, mapping the surrounding terrain and marking every piece of physical evidence he could locate, photographing each broken branch and stripped section of bark from multiple angles before the elements could erode them further. He walked the length of the old logging road several times, searching softer patches of ground the rainstorm may have spared, and found nothing further worth casting. While he worked, local workers familiar with the area mentioned something that reframed the whole search. Several additional wildlife cameras placed throughout the surrounding area by the Biological Survey team had gone missing sometime after the original incident, with no clear explanation. Cameras don't disappear on their own, and Paulides now had physical evidence on the ground, a partial track, damage too high for any known local animal, and a pattern of vanished equipment stretching well beyond the one location he'd come to examine. Paulides now had a shape on camera, a second shape apparently moving in coordination with it, and physical evidence on the ground suggesting something had been there. The next break in the case, however, didn't come from the forest itself. It came from the people who had spent years living and working around it. As word of the footage spread through the surrounding community, local residents began coming forward with their own stories, many of which had never been formally reported. Their accounts didn't simply support what appeared in the video. Instead, they added details that suggested the footage might have been part of a much larger pattern of unexplained activity in the area. A group of hunters who had been in the forest that same morning reported hearing unusual rhythmic wood-knocking sounds several hours before the footage was recorded. Sounds they described as distinct from anything caused by ordinary branches falling, trees rubbing together, or shifting timber in the wind. One of the hunters, a man who had spent decades exploring that same stretch of forest through every season, said the knocking stood out because of its spacing and consistency. Rather than random noises scattered through the woods, the knocks came at measured intervals that felt strangely deliberate. He and his hunting partner had even paused to listen and briefly discussed whether another group of hunters was nearby, though they never found anyone and eventually continued on. It wasn't until the footage became public several weeks later that they began wondering whether the sounds and the recording might have been connected. A camper who had been staying nearby described an overwhelming sense of being watched during her time in the area, strong enough that she and her companions decided to cut their trip short and leave earlier than planned. A logging contractor working in a nearby section of forest reported that his equipment had repeatedly malfunctioned during roughly the same stretch of time, with machinery shutting off unexpectedly for no mechanical reason his crew could identify. None of them had any knowledge of the wildlife camera or its recording until news of the footage began circulating. When Paulides laid their independent timelines against the timestamp on the video file based on their own memories and personal schedules, the details lined up closely, despite none of them having any way to coordinate their stories beforehand. That alone was enough to take seriously. But one detail didn't fit the story Paulides thought he was building. The camper, speaking with Paulides directly, provided something she hadn't shared publicly at first. She recalled a specific moment during her trip when the surrounding forest fell unusually quiet, mirroring the same sudden silence captured in the footage. At the time, she had attributed it to nerves and unfamiliarity with the area. But when Paulides asked her to place that memory against a calendar, it landed the evening before the footage was recorded, not during, before. If she was right, whatever the camera caught on the morning of August 1st wasn't a first appearance. It had already been established in the area at least a day earlier, closer, longer, and more consistently present than 6 minutes of footage could ever suggest. The recording wasn't a chance encounter caught by luck. It was one recorded fragment inside a longer presence nobody had been tracking. That single contradiction undid the assumption Paulides had been working from since his first viewing of the tape, that this had been nothing more than a brief one-time crossing caught by chance. It wasn't. If those reports were accurate, something had been moving through that stretch of forest well before the camera ever recorded it, and possibly long afterward as well. The footage no longer looked like an isolated event. It looked like a small glimpse into activity that had gone largely unnoticed because nobody had been watching at exactly the right moment. Paulides now had a shape on camera, tracks on the ground, witness accounts that stretched the timeline, and a sequence of events that no longer fit the original explanation. The case had become harder to simplify with every new piece of information, yet the detail that would force him to rethink the investigation wasn't hidden somewhere deep in the forest. It had been sitting in the original recovery records the entire time. The missing memory card itself and the unusual way it had disappeared would end up rewriting everything. Going back through the original recovery notes from the biological survey team, Paulides found a detail that had been documented but never seriously examined. When the camera housing was discovered smashed and thrown roughly 50 yards from the tree where it had originally been mounted, investigators noted that the memory card was already missing. It wasn't lodged inside the damaged camera, nor was it lying anywhere around the shattered housing, despite the surrounding area being searched. Weeks later, after heavy rain had washed away part of the leaf litter, a volunteer participating in a follow-up search stumbled across the card buried beneath leaves and loose soil a considerable distance from where the camera itself had landed. The discovery had been logged as an oddity at the time, but nobody had offered a convincing explanation for how it had ended up there. That gap bothered him. A bear knocking a camera off a tree could explain a smashed housing 50 yards away. It could not easily explain a memory card that ended up somewhere else entirely, separated from the unit that had held it. He went back to the recovered file itself and had a technician re-examine the corruption pattern more closely, not to try to repair more of it, but to understand how it had degraded in the first place. The damage didn't spread from a single point of impact, the way a cracked card usually corrupts. It came in bursts clustered at specific timestamps, as if something had interrupted the recording in stages rather than all at once from one moment of physical damage. Paulides cross-referenced those burst points against the missing final 90 seconds of usable footage, the section that had never been recovered. Then he checked them against something he hadn't thought to check before: the equipment logs for the other wildlife cameras that had gone missing from the surrounding area in the weeks after the incident. The timestamps matched. Every burst of corruption in the recovered file lined up with a maintenance log entry for a different nearby camera going dark or losing signal. Paulides checked and rechecked the alignment, worried he was forcing a pattern onto data that didn't actually support one. It held up. Of the 6 corruption bursts in the file, 5 corresponded to a logged equipment failure elsewhere in the network within a window of 2 to 11 hours. The 6th, the burst nearest the missing final 90 seconds, had no matching log entry at all, which meant either the disturbance it represented had never been recorded anywhere else, or the camera closest to it had gone dark before anyone thought to check. Whatever had degraded this recording hadn't simply walked away when the footage ended. It appeared to have moved from camera to camera afterward, and in at least 2 cases appeared to have physically removed the equipment rather than merely damaging it in place. That distinction mattered to Paulides. Damage suggested an animal reacting to an unfamiliar object. Removal suggested something closer to deliberate interference, equipment being taken rather than knocked loose, and it was a distinction the original survey team had never had reason to draw, because nobody had asked them to look at 6 isolated incidents as a single event. That changed the entire shape of the story. This was never a single 6-minute encounter. It was one surviving fragment of a much longer pattern, a presence that had been moving through a mapped, monitored stretch of forest for weeks, interacting with multiple pieces of equipment and leaving behind a trail that no one had connected because no one had thought to look at the cameras as a network instead of 6 separate accidents. Paulides laid the maintenance logs, the timestamp bursts, the witness timeline, and the ground evidence out together for the first time and realized what he actually had. Not one lucky recording of something crossing a logging road, but documented, repeated, cross-referenced contact between this presence and a scientific monitoring network, spanning more ground, more time, and more equipment than any single piece of footage had ever suggested before. What started as one accidental recording from a bear monitoring camera had become something else entirely. A documented pattern across an entire stretch of monitored forest, verified by logs nobody had thought to compare until now. Paulides has stopped short of calling this proof of anything. What he will say is that in his career, he has never had a single piece of footage lead to this much independently verifiable material, equipment logs, a groundcast, corroborating witnesses whose timelines never should have lined up, and a corruption pattern that only made sense once he stopped looking at it in isolation. Investigations into the footage and the surrounding equipment logs are ongoing. Additional witnesses have come forward since the case became public, and Paulides is continuing to cross-reference the Wildlife Agency's full monitoring network for the months before and after August 1st, looking for more gaps in the record that might connect to the same pattern. He has requested the complete maintenance history for every camera in the survey area, going back 2 full seasons, hoping to determine whether the pattern he found in August was an isolated event or simply the first one anyone happened to notice. Whether what he uncovered points to Bigfoot, an unidentified animal, or something else entirely remains unresolved. But what began as a routine bear monitoring camera has become, in Paulides' own words, the first case of his career where the evidence didn't just describe one encounter, it mapped one.